more for recording, so you'll still want to be able to project your voice when we're talking. So we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Robin, would you mind doing the roll call?
Angela Della Porta. Here. Kirsten Flynn. Terry Holzmer. Gail Price. Heather Rosen.
Here.
Len Smith. Yunan Song. Tim Still.
Here.
Lakiba Pittman. C.E. Zhang. Alexander Liu.
Here.
Keith Reckdahl.
Here.
Doria Suma. Valdemar Kazmarski. Whoops. Okay, we have 11 present.
Okay, great. So we have a quorum. So I am Jonathan Late. I'm the Director for the Planning and Development Services Department. I'm joined this evening by Amy French and Rachel Tanner. And we have Robin that's supporting us in the back with roll call, and also Rebecca Atkinson with our planning department as well, helping out tonight. So a couple of just quick housekeeping items. One, again, just if you're going to speak, we would like you to remember to turn on the microphone. I want to thank our technical support for setting up the room. I appreciate you guys coming in advance and setting this up. And we'll have oral communications. We have Christina Dykes from Page and Turnbull to give us a presentation on the historic report a little bit later here. But before we do that, we're going to do the co-chair nomination, and Rachel will guide us through that process. We recognize for the Page and Turnbull report that there may be some members of the community that may have some comments that they also want to offer, so we'll extend another opportunity for public comment here at the beginning, but then also after the report is presented. And then again at the end, we always have an opportunity for oral communications as well. So there's three chances tonight if you're in the audience and you want to speak. You received word that Elena Lee, who has been leading this effort for quite some time now, has taken a position with another community. We're obviously very sad to see her leave. She was tremendously helpful and dedicated to this project, and we'll all miss her, not just for her work on this project, but she's had been with the city for 12 years, and really it's kind of an unfortunate loss for us. But I know she's going to be happy working at this new place that's closer to home and gives her a chance to strike a better work-life balance. So thank you, Elena, if you're out there listening, for all the work that you've done. In the meantime, I've asked Rachel to take on a lead role in helping to orchestrate these meetings, but that will also be somewhat temporary as we recruit for a position to fill Elena's slot. And, typically recruitments can take some time, but we've got a lot of energy behind some other vacancies that we've been filling. So I feel like we'll have better success and be moving along quickly to have a replacement for the group. Okay. So let's see. I think that's it. We'll go ahead and start with oral communications. And Robin, if you have some names to call. And
Steve Levy.
And do we have a place for them to talk?
Yes, so if you
great.
go
There's a
right
microphone
over
right over
there
here.
to the
Yeah,
left.
that one. And
And
so,
how much time, John?
yeah, so I think we typically do 3 minutes.
Okay.
So, first, thank you all for your service. I served on the infrastructure and the comp plan committee, and I have a pretty good sense of how much work is involved and how sometimes it seems like we're going in circles and progress is very elusive. So thank you. I wrote a letter in the packet. There are 3 points. The first, as you know, this area has the largest opportunity site for housing in our comp plan and is completely critical for getting anywhere near our housing element goal and our comp plan goal. It checks all the boxes: close to jobs, close to services, close to shopping, a bus line, close to a Caltrain station that's going to expand during the course of this area plan. And so my main message is, let's make this work. Let's honor our commitment to make this site the largest site that we have for housing. The second 2 points are a little trickier. You know that this community, like most communities, is going through a struggle to define ways to maintain as much local control as you can. Whether you believe in that or you don't believe in that, the fact that this is the largest opportunity site means that if somehow it gets diminished or eliminated, that means the city of Palo Alto, not you, but the council, is not serious about maintaining local control. So this is the largest test case for whether a community can actually build housing where it located housing for. The third point is even tougher. The new RENA regional housing allocations will probably be at least double for the region. I don't know what they'll be for Palo Alto. So when this area plan finally gets to council, the housing element that we have with this site will be massively out of date. And the new housing element will have to produce a lot more housing. The caution is that I've been to a number of HCD meetings, and they will look very awkwardly at taking your largest opportunity site out of housing. I've been to a lot of these meetings. I know there are a myriad of objections. All cities have objections. HCD understands that. We're not special. Let's make this work for market rate housing, for low and moderate rate housing, for a great mixed use community. Let's not be the first city that they sue. Thank you.
Patricia Saffer.
Okay, my name obviously is Patricia Saffer, and I'm a 57-year resident of South Palo Alto. And I want to speak to you tonight about the 12-acre Fry's electronics site. We all acknowledge that Palo Alto has a critical housing shortage and that lack of suitable sites is one of the major causes. For many years, since the 1980s, this site has been regarded as a prime housing site and was once actually zoned for RM30 with a mandatory commercial phase-out. The only reason that this was rescinded was because Fry's was such a lucrative sales tax source. Now we're going to lose Fry's anyhow, so what a perfect time to review the plans to use the site for housing. It's near bus and rail transit and set far enough from single-family homes to allow a fairly dense development, at least on part of the site. Therefore, I urge you to make decisions that will encourage major mixed housing on this site. Thank you for giving us a chance to speak.
And Karen Holman.
Hi, and thank you. And thank you for your work on this, staff and certainly working group members. A few things. One is I didn't see a staff report. When I got here, I saw a handout over here that is just responses to questions from Paige and Turnbull. Thank you for those responses. And also some comments from the public, but I didn't see a staff report. So I'm a little concerned about the progress and the process that the working group is going to be able to utilize if there's not a staff report for them to digest issues and thoughts ahead of time. Another is, I think one of the things that has been missing, I think there are a few things that I've mentioned before that have been missing, and working group members have as well, but one of the things that's been missing is that there's not a housing and park requirement comparison chart that's been provided. So in other words, I'll just totally make up numbers here. So if the site accommodates, or the area accommodates 100 housing units, what does that equate to in acres of parkland? So in other words, if you're going to do one thing, how does that affect the other? You got to know, where to tip that scale. That's another. Page and Turnbull is a very accomplished and capable entity, and CEQA requires that CEQA requires that before any demolition could happen of any kind of historic resource, that all reasonable and feasible alternatives be explored. That's true of any significant impact. It's not just historic resource demolition. It's whether it's traffic impacts or whatever. I would suggest, and please ask, that Page and Turnbull be engaged to look at creative and reasonable and feasible alternative uses, adaptive reuses for both 340 Portage and the former dormitory there. Recall that, I've mentioned this before, but just want to make sure it's understood and not forgotten, that housing sites, inventory sites, can be rejiggered. For instance, if one site is allocated 1,000 units, but you've got other sites where you can put, 80% of those or 50% of those, you can reallocate. ABAG is fine with that. MTC is fine with that. So just so you know, you're not wedded to one particular thing. And also, last time we talked a little bit about renaturalizing the creek, and there was some talk about just renaturalizing the one segment that's adjacent to the 340 Portage site. I suggest that not only were there funding options that should be explored, that those have come up before, so for instance, Santa Clara Valley Water District, or the Water District as I call it now, but also to talk to Fish and Wildlife and see what are the possibilities there. What kind of an asset could this really be? What kind of a natural asset could this be to our community, to Barron Park, going upstream, and what kind of a really wonderful, no pun intended here, but tributary this could be for this area. Imagine that, with refreshed banks and refreshed water stream, water flow. So, thank you.
That is it.
Okay, great. So that concludes our oral communications portion of the agenda. And I'll turn it over to Rachel in just a moment here. But I did want to sort of acknowledge, we are, we want to be respectful of your time, and we know that all of you are busy, and we're trying to balance that with also keeping engagement in the process. And so we understand that, our agendas are not now as full as they've been in the past, which on one hand is a good thing because we were saying that they were too full and we didn't have enough time for dialogue, but now we're at the other end where we don't have as much to share with you. And so it may be that we don't take the whole evening tonight and go all the way to 8:30. We're obviously here, and we're happy to support the working group to that end. We're trying to tee up topics that we think are of interest to you that also we can support given our resources for these working group meetings. But behind the scenes, we are working with our consultant, and we are coming up with some strategies for future meetings. I'll mention that toward the end, what we're planning for the next meeting, and so that we're thinking ahead about that. But tonight, we do actually have a purposeful item related to Page and Turnbull, but I don't know if you're going to do the co-chairs before that or not. I'll turn over to Rachel. She'll tell us.
That was what I was planning to do. So we're on the discussion items portion of the agenda. So item 1, selection of NVCAP working group co-chairs. So remember when we went to the city council, I guess that was in July now, they were supportive, and we were supportive of selecting co-chairs, and so we wanted to get that on the agenda for this meeting. And so what we would propose is that if there is anyone who would like to nominate someone who is here to accept the nomination, if they're nominated, to be a co-chair, we'll open the floor for nominations. You can also nominate nominate yourself if you would like to be a co-chair. And then what we'll do is everyone will have 2 votes and we'll do 2 rounds. So the first round, you'll just have 1 vote and everyone will vote 1 time, and we'll see who the top vote getter of that round is, and then we'll have a second round where you can use your second vote. And our idea is to have the top 2 vote getters to be the co-chairs. And just a reminder, if you're thinking, do I want to do this? Do I want to nominate someone to do that? What are they going to be doing? The idea is that these 2 co-chairs would work with myself, our consultants, whomever we hopefully quickly hire to fill Elena's role to help to plan the agendas. So I think to Jonathan's point around making sure our agendas are not just full, but full of meaning and have meaningful items and also meaningful ways to connect with you and connect with the working group and the members of the public that are here around the topic. So probably an additional meeting, it could be by phone. So if you work during the day, hopefully you can participate via phone. Don't think that you have to, come to City Hall during the workday, or we can maybe schedule an early evening time for the co-chairs, the staff to connect and to think about the meeting. We do want to stay on the timeline that we'll have with our consultant, Perkins and Will, who is our master consultant over the project and has subs working under them, so that we can keep moving forward with development of 3 alternatives, moving that towards getting working group and community input, and then ultimately going to City Council, PTC along the way, ARB along the way, to get their buy-in on what the preferred alternative is as we pursue crafting that into an adopted area plan for this area. So that's kind of where this is headed. Terry, do you have a question? Okay, maybe I'll just have, if there's any questions before people are ready for nominations, just in case there's anything that you are curious about. Doria?
So we didn't have any sort of process distributed us, so should there be a first and a second and then a general vote, or how are we going to do it?
So we can ask for seconds. I was just gonna, if people wanted to nominate either, well, the people have, if you nominate someone else, they have to accept the nomination. So that's the first thing. And if someone nominates themselves, then we're just gonna put their names there and then have the votes. If we want to do seconds, we can. We're a relatively small group, so I guess if we have 11 nominees, maybe we'll be in trouble. But if we only have a handful, hopefully we can work that out. Does that seem okay, Doria, to folks?
Yeah.
To do it that way? Okay.
Does the Brown Act require any special, are there rules that go along with the Brown Acted committee with regards to votes for chairs and co-chairs?
I'm not sure.
No,
Jonathan, are you
so the setting that we have is this informal sort of polling process is satisfactory. I mean, we're doing it in the open. We're being really transparent about it. If you want to nominate somebody, we'll list it on here. And if that person also wants to be, willing to do it, we're fine doing it this way. From a staff perspective, we don't have any concerns about it. If the working group has discomfort, we're happy to have a conversation about that.
Okay, so no further questions. We'll open the nominations. Oh, one more question. Okay, Angela?
Yeah, what exactly would be the, I guess, the job description of the?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, and Jonathan can fill in because he was here for part of the discussion before I began in this role. I really see a couple things. One is working with staff to make sure the agenda is full and meaningful, but not too full. I would hope to get feedback, honest feedback, right, about if that's too much, it's not enough, I don't understand, we need to explain this more, so that we are making sure that we're meeting and reaching and communicating well with the working group members and connecting with you all regarding the topics that we are covering. So it's really great for us who are, living in the planning world to kind of get a little bit of a check. Okay, we're residents, maybe very engaged residents, and some people's are professionals, but everyone is not. And so how do we make sure we have the agenda, the materials, reach everybody, meet everybody's needs, so we can all kind of come along on the process? That's something I'm very much looking forward to working with the co-chairs on. And then also, sometimes folks may feel more comfortable talking to a co-chair than staff, and so we would hope that if there are any messages that need to be relayed from working group members to staff, that the co-chairs would do so that we can make sure we're keeping in touch in that regard with folks as well. John, there's anything else you'd like to add to the job description? And then meeting with staff.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's just a conduit for us to engage a small subset and have a better read on the working group, the needs and expectations. And to the extent that we're able to, as a partnership, mitigate and manage that, that's the objective here. So we see it as a collaborative, working together. We're all moving toward the same objective. Let's have a functional program that we all feel is rewarding and of value.
Okay, Keith?
I have a question about, for SOFA, one of the co-chairs was a resident and one was a landowner. Are we going with that model, or is it just any two members of the board?
I think that is a great suggestion. I would love to hear what the other working group members think, if it should be kind of thinking in that regard. And if that's the case, then we could, take nominations, divide the nominees into those two groups. And so can you repeat what it was? It was residents and it was?
I believe for SOFA, I wasn't in SOFA, but,
So I might just, Karen, for just one moment. Yeah, I feel like for the representation of this group is composed of owners, residents, people who own land, and also work in the area. So I think as a working group whole, we've got that representation covered. For this purpose of co-chair, which is a somewhat informal interaction with staff to set the agendas, having that formality I don't think is necessary and may be borne out in the voting process itself. So from our perspective, we don't feel that is necessary. Again, this isn't a role that is adding undue influence into the process. We still have a schedule and an agenda that we need to advance. It's an opportunity for checking in and making sure that there's just collaboration as opposed to setting direction on necessarily the specific topics, because we, working with our consultant, are going to have to present those topics. We could work with the co-chairs on how we present those topics and what materials might be needed in advance of that, as opposed to sort of forming the direction, if that adds any clarity, and I'm happy to add more to that.
I wasn't going to state an opinion. I was only going to, it seemed like there was a question being asked. I was only going to clarify that it was indeed a resident, myself, and Larry has a property and business owner. They were co-chairs. No opinion.
But you could keep that in mind for your nominations.
And actually, that's why we've staged it in 2 rounds, so that the first round, individuals in this room may have ideas about who they would like to see on the as co-chairs, and if your first nominee doesn't rise to that level, then that sort of gives you another chance to focus your attention on that. So that's why we landed on this model as opposed to, other models that we had contemplated.
Great. Okay, any further comments or questions? With that, I think Terry has a nomination.
Yes, I'd like to nominate Angela Della Porta, and I'll give a few reasons, quick reasons why. First of all, besides being a very nice and pleasant person, Angela has a great neighborhood organizer. She cares about her neighborhood a great deal, which is the Ventura neighborhood. I'm on the north end of that, the Mayfield neighborhood, but I honestly believe that a representative of Ventura should be a principal person to lead us. I mean, since this will affect their neighborhood in a tremendous way. And I think somebody as skilled and somebody who works as a balanced person, I believe, would be a great addition and also a great chairperson. Not chairman, chairperson. So that's who I nominate.
Angela, do you accept the nomination?
I would like to make a nomination. I'd like to nominate Gail Price. I think she's a tremendous amount of experience in being on the council. She's very well spoken, and I think has a vision for a future neighborhood and how to accommodate growth. But she understands that from being on the council, you have to balance the needs of everybody in the city. So I think she'd be a great addition.
And Gail, do you accept the nomination? Okay. Are there any other nominations?
Sorry, I want to nominate myself. The reason is only I don't have any single issues going into the process. I think I could be an honest broker. I live in a neighborhood, actually very close to the main area, and my main interest is that the project actually happens, and also that's just nice place.
All right. And can you spell your last name? I don't see your name tag in front of you.
Can we just go by first?
Okay, that's fine. If that works for you, that works for me.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Victoria?
I would actually like to nominate Tim Steele if he's willing, because I think it does make sense to have representative of the largest property owner, if he accepts.
Thank you, Tim. Any others? Going once, going twice. Okay, nominations are closed. So, if we will have our first round of votes, and please we'll ask you to, we'll go down each person, Angela, Gale, and then Waldeck, and then if you are voting for that person, please raise your hand when you are voting for that person. You only have one vote in the first round, and then one vote in the second round, and then we will tally them up. Okay? Jonathan, you have that duty. You're my check and balance. There we go. Oh, goodness. Well, we can have Amy do it if you. Jonathan's been without his glasses for 2 weeks somehow, so. Okay, so first round of votes. If you are voting for Angela Della Porta, please raise your hand. Keep your hands raised, please.
You're only voting once.
Okay, everyone, just keep your hands raised if you're voting for Angela, please. One, just high. Okay, 10. Are there any votes in the first round for Gail Price? And any votes for Waldeck in the first round? People are voting twice. You can only vote once in the first, you have 2 votes. 1 vote in the first round and 1 vote in the second round. So let's start over again. I was like, this is too many people. Okay. I think we have all our members except for 1, so we should have 13, I believe, working group members. I believe that's our number.
Yes.
Okay, lucky 13.
I'm sorry, at the risk of being overly bureaucratic about this. So we're gonna do first round, and we'll get 1 person that will be in that category, and then we're going to carry over the names to the second round. And if anybody wants to add another name, we'll have that opportunity, and then we'll do another round of voting. Okay? All right. So first round.
Sorry about that. Okay, so first round, take 2. If you would like to use your 1 vote in first round for Angela, please raise your hand. And raise it high and keep it until Jonathan and Amy dismiss your hand.
Yes, I see 80.
Okay, please put your hands down. If in your first round vote you would like to vote for Gail, please raise your hand and keep it raised. If your first round vote you would like to use for Waldeck, please raise your hand. And we'll just do a little check. Make sure we got it. Yep. Everybody can see. There it goes, right? Just to say it's official vote count, you know. Everything's out in the open. All right, great. So Angela, congratulations. You are our first co-chair. Thank you again for serving. Are there any other nominations that anyone would like to make for the second round?
So wait,
So there's 2 will carry over.
the 2 will carry over? So I'd like to nominate Kirsten Flynn, who's also a neighbor in North Ventura.
Kristen, do you accept the nomination? I should ask. Okay. Okay. All right. If you'd like to use your one vote in the second round for Gail Price, please raise your hand and keep your hand raised so we can see. Okay.
Oh, 7.
Oops.
It was 8.
Oh, okay.
If you, we can continue just to make sure we complete it. If you'd like to use your second vote in the second round for Waldeck, please raise your hand. All right. Hey. Gotta believe in yourself. And if you would like to vote for, it's Kristen or Kirsten? Sorry, I'm confusing it now. Please raise your hand. Great. Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Gail, for also being able to serve as another co-chair. We know that it's not too much more work, but it is more work, and we just want to thank you in advance for your time and look forward to working with both of you. So thank you again.
Your first assignment is to find us a project manager.
We are going to turn it over to Christina. Is it Dykes? From Page and Turnbull, who has been one of our great consultants working on the historic report for the project area. So she has a PowerPoint presentation that she's going to give. You also have the notes, a response in your packet, and then you should have received I think at previous meetings, the report on Page and Turnbull. You may also have watched the Architectural Review Board or the Historic Resources Board meeting, which was last month?
July.
Already July 25th. Goodness, it's September. Okay, that was also very informative, and I believe that the granddaughter of Thomas Finchu attended and spoke a little bit. So that was great to be able to have her come and kind of bring some history to life in that way. So Christina, take it away.
Thanks, Rachel. So I am an architectural historian and associate principal at Page and Turnbull. Our office is in San Francisco, but we do a lot of work here in Palo Alto, including the historic resource evaluation that we wrote for 340 Portage and what we call a windshield survey of other buildings that are 50 years old and potentially historically significant within the plan area. This presentation will be a little bit similar to the HRB presentation that I gave 2 months ago. So if you were there or have seen it, there'll be some repetition. But before I get to that part about these actual sites, I'm going to give a little bit more of a high-level overview of what it means to do historic resource evaluation for the California Environmental Quality Act, and hopefully provide a little bit of background information, some historic preservation 101, if you will. Hopefully it won't be confusing to you. Try to streamline it. So first of all, historic resources are recognized as part of the environment under CEQA, similar to air quality and traffic, biological resources. There are a slew of different environmental factors. And so historic resource evaluation is triggered by either a proposed project on a site or a plan like this one for a city. And there are 3 primary questions that we ask. The first is the property historic resource? If it's already been designated or has not yet been analyzed yet, then we go ahead and do that. And that's where we are right now with this. Then there are 2 follow-up questions once you have your plan or your specific project, which is, would the project or plan cause a substantial adverse change in the significance of the resource? And if there is an impact that's identified, can it be avoided or mitigated? And Karen had actually mentioned this a little bit earlier today. As a little bit more of an overview, there are generally 3 levels of historic resource registers. There's a National Register of Historic Places, which is administered by the National Park Service through the California Office of Historic Preservation, which is in Sacramento. Generally, properties that are listed in the National Register, it's an honorary listing. There isn't necessarily additional protections provided. There are some incentives that are sometimes provided to having a property on the National Register and being able to restore it, but the California Register is really what we focus on for CEQA. It's administered through the California Office of Historic Preservation. Nominations are approved by the State Historical Resources Commission, which meets quarterly, and it's really the primary threshold in terms of CEQA analysis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then lastly, there are often local registers in various cities. Palo Alto has a historic inventory, which is the list of site structures and districts designated by City Council. These are the category 1 through 4 properties, if you are familiar with that at all. And the procedure for nomination and designation is outlined in the Historic Preservation Ordinance. So CEQA guidelines outline what is considered a historic resource or historically significant, and typically it's that properties meet the criteria for listing in the California Register. Typically, properties are considered to have the potential to be historically significant if they're 50 years old or older. Though that's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. Sometimes there are properties younger than 50 years old that are already recognized as being historically significant. But this is the reason why, as I'll explain a little bit later, we looked at all of the properties within the plan area that were 50 years or older. And then just a note, for the purposes of CEQA review, properties only need to be found eligible for listing in the California Register to be considered a historic resource and therefore be evaluated in the next stages for potential impacts to the resource, depending on what the plan or the specific project, how it's treated. They don't necessarily have to go through a process of actually nominating or listing. There are a couple of footnotes to this. One is that properties that are listed in the National Register are automatically listed in the California Register. So any properties that are listed on the National Register are considered historic resources for CEQA purposes. But if you find a property just to be eligible for listing in the National Register or local register, that's not considered historic resource for CEQA purposes. So the key is, in this case, is that we have identified property that is eligible for the California Register. I know it's a little confusing. So I'm going to focus on the California Register from here on out. Individually, there are 4 criteria for potential historic significance. And so what we do in a report like a historic resource evaluation is we go to the site and we do a visual survey and we write a detailed description of what the property looks like. We do historic research and produce what we call a historic context. It's a historic narrative of the history of the property, its development over time, how the building or the site has changed over time, people who are involved, kind of broader context about industries or other things that may factor into the story about this property. And then we use these criteria to evaluate whether the property is historically significant within those contexts. So you can find a property to be significant for any or all of these. You only need one, but criterion 1 is significant events or pattern of events. Criterion 2 relates to significant persons, and generally it's the best representation of the most productive period in that person's life. So not necessarily, as we call it, the George Washington slept here. And criterion 3 relates to architecture, architectural design being a good example of a significant architect's work. In Palo Alto, oftentimes we'll find properties designed by Burge Clark to be significant under criterion 3 because he was an important local architect. And then criterion 4 has to do with the potential to yield important information. This typically involves archaeology, and we actually don't analyze properties under this because we're architectural historians and looking at the physical building instead. But you really need two things to be eligible for the California Register. You have to meet at least one of these criteria for significance and also possess historic integrity, which is the survival of physical characteristics that existed during the resource's period of significance. So if we have a reason for significance, we'll identify the period in which it was significant. It's either a year or a range of years, and then the property must retain enough of the physical materials and features to be able to resemble what it did at that time closely. And you need both of those things to be eligible. So with that, that's the conclusion to my overview, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the properties that we evaluated here. Quick question?
I have a quick question. Just to give reference, how many properties in Palo Alto right now are on the National Register and on the State Register and in the City Register?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you?
All I know is that in 1998-2000, the survey resulted in 165 National Register eligible properties. We shipped out to the state.
Okay. But we don't know how many are actually on the
Well, we
register?
do, but I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay.
So I'm happy to provide that.
Yes, there are a few historic districts.
Technically 4 national registers. Oops.
Okay, we'll move forward. So the first thing that we did was what we call a windshield survey. This is where it was a high level. We didn't do historic research on property by property, but we looked at every property within the plan area that was at least 50 years old, primarily residences, but some commercial buildings. We had a historic context that we developed of the overall neighborhood, general things that happened in development trends over time, and provided an opinion about whether any of these buildings appeared to be historically significant. Ultimately, what we found was that the majority of the residences were built in 1946, right after the war. There were a few that were earlier than that, one in 1940, one in 1904, 1942, 1948, a couple in 1968, but the majority of these buildings 50 years or older were from the right after World War II. And then of commercial buildings, a lot of them were built in the early 1960s. Based on the historic context of the development of the neighborhood, we felt that the residential portion of the neighborhood primarily was part of post-war boom in Palo Alto and the Bay Area, as opposed to potential connection to the adjacent cannery site, which closed in 1949, or other potential reasons. So ultimately, we found that none of these buildings appeared to be individually historically significant. But then we evaluated 340 Portage, the Fry's building, separately from this survey. So we looked at this property much more carefully. There was already kind of an identification that there might be some historic significance, which is why we wrote a historic resource evaluation just on this building. So we looked at both the big building, which was built in stages between 1918 and the 1940s. And we also found, after we started to do the research, that there is this office building which was associated with the cannery that we think was built between 1918 and 25. We think it may have been a dormitory for cannery employees and was moved to this current location in 1940. It's a little unclear. We used historic maps and I think a building permit that mentioned moving an office, and kind of put 2 and 2 together. So not totally clear, but we do know this is an older building and very likely had been somewhere else on the site and moved to this spot. So we have a map above. This is called a Sanborn Fire Insurance map, if you're not familiar with them. Sanborn Fire Insurance Company illustrated maps every number of years for fire insurance purposes, but they're really helpful for architectural historians because they show the building footprints of buildings in your neighborhood developing over time, and we can compare an earlier year to a later year and see how changes occurred. What we found was that, let's see if I have anything else that I missed here. I do have some notes, and I've just been talking off the top of my head here. Agricultural industries, including fruit and vegetable canning, were once a dominant industry in Santa Clara County. Most of you, or all of you, probably know this. The oldest portions of this cannery building were constructed in 1918 for the Bayside Canning Company, which is owned by Chinese immigrant and prominent canning mogul Thomas Foon Chu. Under Chu, the Bayside Canning Company rose to become the third largest fruit and vegetable cannery in the world in the 1920s, behind only Libby and Del Monte. After Chu's death, the cannery was subsequently purchased and operated for more than 20 years by the Sutter Packing Company, another fruit and vegetable cannery. The Sutter Packing Company significantly expanded the cannery building and its operations through the 1930s and 40s, as it prepared for and raced to meet the demands of World War II. The expansion projects included the construction of the Exton office building. Oh, that might not be true. For a time, the cannery was the largest employer in the Mid-Peninsula, and when it closed in 1949, it was the largest employer in Palo Alto. The trajectory of canning operations at the plant, which began in the early 20th century, peaked in the 1920s, increased production to meet the demands of World War II, and then quickly declined as residential development and new industries began to replace agricultural industries in the post-war period. It corresponds closely to the broad pattern of the history of the canning industry in Santa Clara County. The building is a rare surviving example of Palo Alto's and Santa Clara County's agricultural past. So the period of significance that we identified under Criterion 1, which you may recall was association with events or patterns of events, was identified as 1918 to 1949. We also evaluated for the other couple of criteria. We did do an in-depth analysis about the association with Thomas Foon Chu. For a property to be found eligible for the California Register under Criterion 2, it must be associated with a person that's contributed significantly to local, state, and national history, and the property must be the best representation of the reason why the person was significant. The building at 340 Portage Avenue was originally built by Thomas Foon Chu in 1918. It was the second canning plant for his Bayside Canning Company. The first was in Alviso. He is regarded as the primary driving force behind the Bayside Canning Company's growth into the third largest fruit and vegetable cannery in the world by 1920. We found, though, that in spite of his association with this property, the building is not the first canning plant constructed by Chu, nor was it the site of his pioneering asparagus canning innovations, which we mentioned in the HRE. In addition, and this is key for our evaluation in this historic resource evaluation report, it was extensively expanded after Chu's death, primarily when it was owned and operated by the Sutter Packing Company. So again, the majority of the 1930s and 40s. So the building doesn't retain enough historic integrity, that second part of the two-part evaluation, to choose period of association to be significant under Criterion 2, though his contribution to the industry is reflected during the early portion of that Criterion 1 period of significance. So he is recognized for his contribution within the pattern of events, but not necessarily specifically for him. And then in terms of Criterion 3 architecture, we found that the property consists of what was originally several connected cannery facilities and associated warehouse buildings. It's primarily constructed of reinforced concrete with utilitarian wood post and beam construction and minimal ornamentation, consistent with its functional design. The former office building, meanwhile, is a plain wood frame building built in a vernacular style. Neither of the buildings appear to exhibit artistic value, nor are they distinctive examples of canning building or industrial warehouse typologies to be individually significant. So we found that it was not significant under Criterion 3. So ultimately, concluding We did find the property to be a historically significant property under criterion 1 for events. We outlined important, what we call character defining features of the building. It is considered a historic resource for CEQA purposes, which means that in the outcome to this plan process, there will be an environmental impact report, and whatever happens with this site will be evaluated for those next steps of potential impacts in that document.
Thank you. So I think what we'll do is take public comment on this portion. There may be questions that members of the public have that might influence our discussion, and then so that way we can be aware of what the curiosities of members of the public would be on this. Are there any members of the public wishing to make public comments on this item, Robin?
Okay, Cedric, go ahead, go up and speak, and then go ahead and fill out your card.
And we'll have 3 minutes.
So the one that you, the one building that you said was the historic one was the small upper one in the upper left. Is that correct photo?
It's both the large cannery and the office building. You can kind of see in the.
Maybe what we'll do, Christina, is we can take the questions and then we can. That way we can, you can have your 3 minutes and then we'll take your questions and make sure she answers all of them. Does that make
Okay.
sense? That way we don't interrupt your time.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I don't think I need all that much time. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to have some small buildings to be historically maybe preserved. I would note historically before this it was beautiful moist meadows and natural space. So that's also a significant historic phase of this property. So I just would hope that the whole giant Fry's building wouldn't be deemed completely off limits to development, as I think that kind of puts the kibosh on significant housing, which we need in this area. So I would hope that the deliberations contain it to smaller, more significant subsets of the buildings. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any more public comment, Robin? Okay, public comment is closed. And then I think we have Christina here until about 7. Maybe she can say a teeny bit longer, but if we have questions that we want to ask her, and then also comments that working group members may have. Terry?
Hi, Christina. We met at the HRB meeting. A couple things. First of all, I'd like to quickly mention that this letter that we just got in response to my responses, I just received in the last day. And I noticed that the date of this was in August that you responded. And I think that I would like to encourage staff, if they do get a response from questions that this committee may ask, that we can receive it in a more timely manner. That would be very helpful. I would like to mention some things that you mentioned, Christina. And first of all, I want to say what a great report that your organization, Page and Turnbull, did. It was very detailed and very accurate in many respects. I do have some issues, though. And under criteria 2, you mentioned that this site, it must be obviously a person who has contributed significantly to local or state history. And I don't think there's any doubt that Thomas Foon Chu was a significant person. But I'd also like to mention the last part of that statement, which says, and the property must be the best representation of the reason for which that person is significant. Well, you mentioned a couple other sites that potentially might be historical significant. I visited I visited one of those sites in Alviso this past weekend. I don't know how many people on this group have visited that site, but this building is quickly, rapidly deteriorating, fast. I mean, I predict that within 2 years, there will be no building there. That's how fast it's deteriorating. So to say that this building there might be other sites that are more significant. The only thing that will be significant a year from now will be the plaque in the ground. And so I even brought pictures that I would like to share. They're black and white pictures, which are unfortunate, but they show the cupola, for example. The roofs are totally collapsing inside. If you look at these pictures of the front of the building, there's major cracks, structural cracks. And so the point I'm trying to make is that I think our property here in Palo Alto is of major significance because it is in pretty good shape. It does need some work probably as well. But this could be the last remaining wood structured cannery building in all of Santa Clara County. And because Santa Clara County was known as the Heart's Delight, maybe you know that, the history of cannery in this area, I think this building is of major significance, not only to us in Santa Clara County, but maybe to the nation, to the country itself. Because these cans, which were produced here and fruit shipped all over this country, supplied this country throughout World War II, World War I, and were significant in that regard. Okay, that's criteria 2. I'd also like to mention criteria 3. And I didn't have enough time to write down everything, but one of the things that struck me about your responses, Christina, was that it is currently unknown if these spaces contain the howled trusses. And like I said, I just received this report today or yesterday. And so I think before we can say that it doesn't meet criteria 3, we need to do more research and find out if that's true or not true. Okay. Finally, one of my things I would like to repeat, which is one thing Karen Holman said, I think Page and Turnbull would be a great person to engage in looking at alternative uses of the Fry's building and the office building. And their input would be very valuable to this working group. And I'd like to encourage the city to consider that, making them in some way an active part in this process. Okay, those are my comments.
Why don't we get a few more comments from people, and then if there's responses, we can just kind of get a little bit under our belt. So we have Angela, and then we have Waldeck, and we'll just kind of go around this way. And I see Kirsten has a hand after that.
Okay, thanks. So I just have 2 quick questions. First of all, I didn't quite understand if the entire building had been declared eligible or just those 2 older parts of the building.
It's in this bottom picture, you can kind of tell there's a colored outline.
Yeah.
The entire cannery building and then the little blue office building that's at the bottom right. Both of those together on the site are considered one historic resource in our report.
Okay, and then the other question is, I'm not sure if being going through the CEQA process or being on the historical register, I guess that's really, if being on the historical register prevents something from being used as housing.
Amy, do you want to respond to that? I think the question kind of is like, what limitations happen to a building that's historic? Can it change from something else to something else?
Can it still be used as housing if it's historical?
Amy French. So as part of a CEQA analysis, this would be mulled over as far as potential land uses. So we would have a proposed land use, which we do not have, and alternative land uses. Those would all be looked at through a lens of CEQA. To the extent that, there's some character defining features, as mentioned in the report, that were proposed to be modified, that would have to be looked at. Are the modifications consistent with the Secretary of Interior standards? And of course, we have Page and Turnbull helping us with these analyses and recommendations. To the extent there's physical changes or to the extent there's land use changes, that would all be subject to the CEQA analysis.
Thanks, Angela. Waldeck? Mm-hmm.
So I am basically looking at this photograph at the top, and the current condition of this building is significantly different. And that was basically changed over time, and we arrive at what we see right now, right? So physically, like, to which point in the history are we actually going to relate to? Like, what are we trying to leave, and what can we change? And still, I mean, is this just a site? Is it just like plan, or is it three-dimensional aspect of it? I don't see necessarily the continuity of this kind of like from the point of original creation, right? It's kind of evolving over time. So you could, like, just being a devil's advocate, right? Look at the plan and say, okay, so this is a site that's significant. Let's build on that site something totally new and make it still significant. Or how far do we need to go into preventing the alternations to that structure?
So we identified a kind of a long series of events, the full use of the cannery as a cannery from 1918 to 1949, including all of the changes that occurred to the site as it grew over time. And so all of that is considered historically significant. There have been some changes since then to turn it into commercial use that it is now, but we felt that there was enough original materials and historic integrity to represent its significance. I think your question about what can be done with the building is the next step, really. It's not something that's dealt with in the report that we've written so far. We've just kind of taken that first step to identify that we have a historic resource and it has some physical features that represent its period of significance. And so the next steps are to determine what potentially could be done and what that might mean for the historic building.
Did I answer your question? And a little bit. And I know Tim is going to make, I think, some comments later this evening about, you have a question as well?
First, you mentioned a date when you think the office building was moved. Could you give me more information on why you know this is a historic building when you suggested that it might be, but not for sure? And what year was that?
There was a permit from 1940 that said that an office building was moved, and we looked at Sanborn maps. Based on the architecture of the building, it looks earlier. It looks to be 1940 or earlier. It definitely has an architectural style that's kind of 1920s, a little bit craftsman-like. So using that, and then also I was looking at these Sanborn maps that show building outlines, and there's a dormitory that had been over in an area. There's an area that used to have, here on the left, a series of worker housing, and a couple of these longer buildings with a porch at the short end, and that is very similar to this building. And so even though this building doesn't sit in this particular location, that kind of configuration of a long building with a porch on the short end seemed like it would be quite possible to have been that office that was moved in 1940. So it is putting some different pieces of information together, which is how we do our historic research sometimes. Great.
I'm not being bought by the lack of confidence in the presentation on what actually being the building that got moved and that is in its current condition. But if you wouldn't mind, please go back to the earlier picture that you had up when you started here. Is the Sutter packing plant 1940 referring to the picture above?
Yes.
And then 1941 is referring to the picture on the right?
Mm-hmm.
They expanded that much in a year.
And the project would have been essentially doubled in size between the left picture and the right picture in 1 year.
I think the
Doesn't look to me to be in context.
top picture, there are more buildings off to the side.
But the two buildings, the building in the middle of the upper building with the two elevated roof structures is embedded in the middle of the lower picture and surrounded by other buildings that have been built around it. And I don't see how that could have happened.
There's buildings in the upper picture too. I mean,
No, No, I'm
Yeah.
saying is the two buildings there with the roof structures that she's calling out as significant is embedded in the middle of the lower picture, in the middle of it, not on one end or the other. So there's got to be some discrepancy between 1940 and 1941 being accurate.
Yeah. Unless I made an error when making this presentation, the information is in the report, which I don't have in front of me.
Okay. Kirsten had a question, and we'll come back. We'll go finish this way, and then we'll go back around.
So, because you deal with this all the time, can you give us some examples of successful adaptive reuse of industrial buildings? I mean, it seems like that must be something that your office works on to retain what historical detail can be retained. Can you just verbally take us through or send me links or give me a place I can do my own research into times when there have been adaptive reuse of industrial buildings? And we can take this offline if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think.
But I think that would be an important thing for us to know as we go forward, is when it's worked well and when in your historical perspective it has not, and what kind of uses those buildings ended up having.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like you're asking for precedence research.
Yeah, a little bit, but I mean, I don't know how much time you have contracted with the city, so I don't know if that can happen, but if you just want to send me a website because you don't have any time remaining on your consulting fees, I understand that. And I just wanted to point that this building in the middle with the big monitor roof has buildings on either side of it in the upper picture. It's part of a continuous band of buildings. The facades are not all at the same face level, but it looks like there might be a courtyard in the red outline building too. So it might be that it's similar era. See how there's a roof monitor on the extreme right, and then a series of roofs before the two large monitor roofs, then a low loading bay type roof, and then another warehouse roof.
Yeah. I think it is a little bit difficult to tell just because the aerial and then the.
And it's
kind
also
of
because
the
we're
side
far away
elevation
from that
view.
photograph too.
Yeah, sure. I think Keith has a hand.
Big picture, how does CEQA go in with the planning process? So the landowner would propose a design, and when they went through planning and transportation, then they would be submitted for CEQA before that, or where does CEQA fall in the planning
Program
process?
level and project level, or?
Sure. So there's two different types of CEQA documents that could be prepared. One would be a programmatic CEQA document that would involve, some more general information about the proposal, and that could include land uses and alternatives and all of those things that you'd expect to find in a CEQA document, an EAR, let's say. Then there can be, then there's project-specific CEQA documents. So typically, the planning department receives an application from a developer and property owner, and that is the time that a CEQA document is prepared. So there's two different paths there.
I'll just add that through this process, we will ask the city council to either affirm, the retention of the building or to allow some kind of modification to it. We're not going to let that be resolved at a second step. I mean, it's such a critical part of what happens here that we can't let that go unanswered. So we'll lay out the different options, and embedded in this process that you're all a part of is the CEQA review process. We have a CEQA consultant, and we will be producing a report that will go along with a plan to the city council eventually.
And so the city council then will say thumbs up, thumbs down about what is kept and what is not kept.
City council makes the final decision on the plan, yes.
Thank you.
My comment's kind of along the same way. This is such a significant part of this site that it basically tilts the schemes that we're going to be considering one way or another. So, yes, if we're doing two separate schemes, then one can be with, one can be without. But it's very difficult to try to go forward without knowing the solution to that site. Meaning that we can go forward only basically in two separate schemes, one with, one without, but we cannot kind of go forward not knowing, because it's just impossible.
So there wasn't a question there, but I'll answer it anyways. You're absolutely right. And actually, we think of it as three options that we'll be exploring. And we'll talk a little bit more about this at our next round. And, I would envision maybe one option preserves the building as it is. And so let's design a scenario that contemplates that, and what does that yield in terms of our other interests for this plan area based on what the city council's identified as its goals. On the other extreme, the building goes away. And then that opens up other opportunities that we may have that are aligned with the city's goals. And then I think there's a third approach where there's a recognition, while it wouldn't meet the CEQA standard for probably retaining the historic resource, there is opportunities where, we could integrate the design and may, have some kind of other respectful sort of recognition and tribute, even if it's not the sort of the existing, structure that you see out there today. So I think there's options. No, I'm not talking about a plaque. I'm talking about, some kind of adaptive reuse, but not of the whole building. But there's so many other factors that go into this beyond the historic, the quality of the building, how much of it gets removed, what uses are going to be inside there. So there's a lot of conversation that needs to take place. My point is, we need to explore some different options. 2/3 of those options probably doesn't meet the CEQA, preservation requirements of a historic resource. One option would, and then the community will have a chance to weigh in on that. This working group will have a chance to weigh in on that, and the city council and the various boards and commissions leading up to the city council will also have a chance to weigh in on that.
Okay.
That's okay. Snarkiness is permitted.
Angela?
So, did I understand correctly that the city council can just override what CEQA says?
No.
Okay.
So let's, so I mean, it's CEQA, to be, that's a whole other category of topic, the California Environmental Quality Act. But no, the city doesn't get a pass, or the council doesn't get a pass on compliance. Everybody needs to comply for qualifying projects. This is a qualifying project, and so we will go through the CEQA process, evaluate this resource. We believe that it's a resource. Then the next question is, how do we, as the first slide indicated, okay, once you've identified this resource, then we'll, I'm missing one of them, but the third one was, okay, how do you avoid the impact, or how can it be mitigated? Okay, so when you get to that third item on the list, that's a decision. And we may find, the community, the city council ultimately, that it can't be avoided, or that it can be avoided, but we're going to choose to not retain it because there are other interests that the city council has that are more important than the preservation of the existing building, such as we need more housing, and that would be an override, what's called a statement of overriding considerations. And that's the official action that the city council would have to go through. They would adopt a resolution to say, we recognize this is a historic resource, and we're going to acknowledge that it's going to be removed because we're going to have this other benefit that is of broader community interest, i.e. housing or whatever the list of things that we may have. So that's a really truncated way of just kind of explaining a really complex topic, but it is the local government, the folks that you appoint or elect into office, that ultimately has that authority to make that decision. They have the ability to make that decision.
Okay, I thought CEQA was some, distant.
No. So, no. Yeah, no, and just one last piece on CEQA, because I think it is important to clarify. So it stands for the California Environmental Quality Act.
Right.
And CEQA, the main sort of tenet behind CEQA is that it is a disclosure document. It simply wants, to further truncate this complex topic, decisions were being made without the transparency of understanding the impacts of those decisions. So CEQA is a whole system set up to disclose to the public, importantly, and to decision makers, if you make this decision, here are the consequences. It doesn't say you can't make that decision. It's just saying that if you go through that path, understand these are what the consequences are. Okay.
Gail, and then we have Doria and Alex.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to get a clarification because this issue keeps coming up, a project-specific EIR versus a program EIR. Now, in the scope of services, securing the environmental consultants, what have they signed up for?
So we're going back to expand their scope with them in light of this new, not new so much anymore, but in light of the historic finding. It is our interest to prepare one, to rely on the general plan EIR to the extent that we're able to do that, enhance that where we need to through some other additional documentation to contemplate the types of changes that were being planned in this area, the traffic impacts to historic resources, any number of the 26 items that we study in a CEQA document. So it is our intent that at the end of this plan, when the council adopts whatever the CEQA document is at the end, that when there is redevelopment, that it is contemplated in that document and no further environmental analysis would be required. That's our intent. We can't predict what the next development. We don't know what's going to happen on this at the 340 Portage, right? We have a concept maybe at the end of this process of what we think it might be, but if the actual project that comes in deviates from that in some way, we'd have to do some other environmental analysis. So we're building to a plan, not a specific project.
Right, which implies a programmatic
That's right.
or a tiered EIR. So as some of these details regarding how one fits into the other,
Right.
It's a bit of a moving target right now.
Yeah, but not a unmanageable one, I would say.
Right, because we're not, at this stage, it's not the detail of a project-specific activity.
That's correct.
And a comprehensive plan tends to be,
More broad.
has development standards, has a lot of richness to it,
That's right.
but it's not a typical project, detailed project description or application, because that's not really where we are or will likely be in the next few years.
That's correct. That's exactly correct. Much in the same way that we had presumably, when we did the zoning code that established all these regulations, that was adopted through some kind of environmental analysis. Today, when a project comes forward, we still do environmental analysis, right? So, but we're doing this with the understanding that we want to contemplate, the likely feasible development so that we're not having to go through another EIR down the road. We can borrow from what we've had and we can say, oh yeah, this was contemplated or it wasn't, and here, let's do this discrete little focus study here.
So you're trying to retain the integrity of the EIR work, whatever form it takes.
Yep.
So you're not going to be spending more and more money refining.
That's right. That's the objective.
That particular EIR vehicle. But, it's, it is confusing to the public, project-specific versus a program EIR. So this is helpful, but I think there's some steps. So, thank you.
Perhaps in your co-chair role, we can fine-tune the presentation of that information.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, we have Doria and exactly right. Doria and then Alex.
Thank you. So a couple of things. One is that I understand that this was made, the zoning was changed here, I think, in the 90s to RM30. And there was an effort at that time to, I guess amortize is the right word, out the other uses. And then in 2006, I think it was, the city council said, no, we want to encourage keeping fries here for a lot of different reasons. And so at that time, there was a mix of the different uses that were required. There was retail and R&D and warehouse. I don't think there was general office at that time. So I think that we need, if you've given us this, forgive me, but I don't think we have a clear understanding of what those uses were at that time, that specific mix per square feet. And I don't think we have good information on the square footage of the building as it is now, the main Fry's building and the other smaller building. And the uses, obviously, no one expects it to be a cannery use, that's silly. And adaptive reuse is the goal of historic preservation, I think. So I think we need to know that mix in 2006 that I believe we're legally stuck to, unless I'm wrong, and you guys can tell me that. And then, on a different note, if we cannot achieve on the Fry site the total number of immediately, sometime in the future, who knows what will happen since the zoning is RM30. But if we can't immediately or in the very near future or in the next iteration of this building, if we can't achieve the number of units that we have on allocated there for our housing element, and I think Karen Holman mentioned this, we can achieve them in other places of the city. And right now we're looking at the potential of adding housing sites on San Antonio. So those were the 2 points that I was kind of interested in making, understanding if I was right, and also asking for more information on that final 2006 square footage use of mix, because I think, mix of uses, because I think we may be stuck to that. So, and just in general, I understand we've been going through a lot of changes on this committee and in the department, so it's all good, but I think I heard a commitment in kind of the opening statements to kind of get more information up on the website in advance of these meetings so that we could be better prepared. And I think that's a really, that's really good news. So thank you very much.
Alex?
Oh, I'm sorry. So, are we responding to
I know that there's a few more minutes for Christina to be here, so I wanted to get comments, and there's people who haven't had a chance to speak, so I wanted to get their comments. That way we can at least, if there's comments or questions for her directly, that she can do that, in the last little bit, so.
I just have one quick comment. Christina, thank you for the report. It's very interesting. And I was wondering if you could go to the aerial photo. There's one part of the report that, yeah, that's great, thank you. That I think is not clear to me, and I would appreciate, like going forward, if there's a way of getting more information, which is. So there is a old cannery building here, and so like I think that your red boundary should actually extend down here. And I know you have the timeline in the report, and if there's a way of like a building permit timeline, and if there's a way of maybe like keying those permits to the site plan, it'd be really useful to me, because I'm actually drawing all of the, drawing the whole site, and I was actually not able to follow the report through on the site plan. So yeah, if you have more information or just raw data, I can try to piece it together, but thank you.
And then I just want to invite, I know we have a couple working group members who haven't spoken yet. If you just have any comments, if you have questions, just things that you want folks to know, your thoughts regarding the historic staff, maybe there's questions that you've had about some of the processes we've talked about. I just want to make sure you have a little bit of Christina's time while she's still here. So you didn't see Lund, Heather, if there's anything that you guys want to add, please let us know.
I have one quick question.
I think you have to turn this up.
Oh.
You're right. Mine turns green.
Yeah, it's
My
fine.
bad, sorry.
No worries. I was just wondering, the different criterions that you use to define this as a CEQA site, does it matter to the logistics of what we can do with this site afterwards, depending on which criterion it was assigned with? Or does that not make any practical difference?
I think in the case of this property, it doesn't really make a difference, mostly because we've already identified a wide period of significance that captures the earliest, it captures the entirety of the canning use.
Okay.
If we had found it to be significant instead for a different reason that had, 1 year of significance or a shorter range, then the list of character defining features might be a little different, or it might just capture the character of the building in a different way. But we have actually captured it in quite a broad way that that reflects a number of, or a series of important events that occurred there over time.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
So I'm curious, how's the fact that this is a historic or has some historical significance would kind of like the timeline for CEQA, like how's that affect the timeline for getting the due diligence and like development process done? Is there any like estimate?
I mean,
Yeah, I don't think it substantially affects our timeline.
Yeah, and maybe one thing we can do in the future is just explain a little bit about CEQA and kind of what it is, because I think we can get a little just, we're referring to it in EIR and acronyms and this and that might not really be helping to illuminate what's happening and kind of how this fits in. So we talked a little bit about historic, and maybe that's the next piece. We can kind of explain how this fits into that larger process. Any other comments? And I know, Tara, you had some things in the beginning, and I was like, I'm going to go and get a bunch of comments and come back, but that was going to be too much for me to remember and write down. So Tara had a couple questions, Christina. I think one was about kind of, it sounded like a question about trusses, which I believe would be maybe something we need to get inside the building to do. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you deal with interiors, or what kind of evaluation those fall under, if any. And then also just kind of this idea that it would be significant in a larger context of the Valley of Heart's Delight overall in this region, and kind of if there are ways that you look at that and evaluate that. And I think there was one other comment, but that's the two that I was.
Yeah, I think Terry
the alternative uses was an idea, I think, and then Kirsten spoke to that, like thinking about what the alternative uses and adaptive uses could be.
Yeah, we were provided access to two of the commercial spaces, if you will, and not a couple of the original spaces, which are at the kind of top end of the overall building in this aerial photo. So we don't know if those trusses are inside, but this is a very large complex with a number of iterations to it, adding over time. And so I think one comment I had made in my response was that even if those trusses are inside, I don't know that that would make this whole building overall historically significant as an individual resource for its architecture if it has a particular kind of truss in one portion. And ultimately, for the purposes of CEQA, you only need to have this building eligible under one criterion. So finding the property to be eligible under criterion 2 or 3 wouldn't really change the process. We've already recognized this building to be a historic resource. It does include trusses as a character defining feature in the historic resource evaluation. So while we could do additional work, my sense was that it wouldn't necessarily change anything significantly about where we are right now with it.
And then are there any other questions before Christina heads out on this topic? And if you think of things later, if you read the report, we can make sure that we can get answers to things.
Yeah.
So you don't have to.
I know there's questions about these images. There might be more clarification in the report, which is a nice thick document, compared to the couple that I selected here for the presentation, to be able to put 2 and 2 together a little bit more.
Great. Thank you. Well, let's give
one
last question. Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed any different changes in attitudes towards historic building over time during your time in working with cities for historic resources? Do you notice that there is a trend to have more respect for historic buildings, more of a trend to say, I want my city to look new and not have quite as much of a nod to the historical resources? How do you feel that that's going in cities?
It depends on the community, really. I think there are communities that have a lot of pride for their historic resources and have a vocal public who makes that a priority. And then there are other communities that are afraid of what they think the consequences might be of identifying historic resources, and think that the identification might prevent future change from happening. So a lot of communities have some kind of a ratio between those two things, and it really depends. I can't say that there's a trend over time. I think the last over a decade that I've been working, it's kind of been about the same. Just depends on the location, really, and the people who are involved, and if there are people who are passionate about their historic buildings and encourage others to be.
Well, let's give Christina a hand and thank her for
Thank
her
you.
time. And thank you all for your questions and just being engaged and taking this in. So Tim, one of our wonderful working group members, had asked to have a few minutes to talk a little bit about this building, its current and future uses. So we thought it would be great and welcome him to just offer some comments and questions so we can kind of, as we're thinking about the past and its future, have insight from Tim.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I thought since the staff meeting with council in, I believe it was July, there was a staff report that rolled this up into that, as well as there was mention that Sobrato didn't have any intentions of redeveloping the site, and I thought that was an interesting time for that to come out. I wanted to give you a little bit of history. I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask me any questions about our intent and talk about it for a few minutes and give you an opportunity to poke at me. Let me start with, we bought it, the property, we, the Sobratos. I'm an employee, I'm not a family member, so I don't get the royalties and benefits that go with the name. But we did buy this property in 2011. It was generally occupied in a very similar fashion that it is today. There hasn't been a lot of changes. We did have in the lowest part of the image on the right, the two bays you can see where the dots, the skylights going across. Those two bays have been occupied by Playground Global. They moved in one bay and then they moved in eventually into the other. And one of the things they've done in their occupancy has celebrated some of the structural characteristics of the building. And in that particular area, is not a Howe truss, but a bow truss. But a bow truss has a very pleasant architectural presence to it. They were in very poor condition. They spent tremendous amount of money restoring the wood to a beautiful look. They did being built so long ago, there's been a lot of upgrades to the building code, especially after the '89 earthquake, structurally. And so for them to occupy this space, it required an inordinate amount of money and effort to restore it to current building code requirements. So there is some appreciation being expressed in the building for the historic nature, even though it's not necessarily specific to the cannery. In 2014, the planning department had an opportunity to take a very similar grant to the one that they have today. But they wanted to do that grant on this project, and the VTA MTC had suggested they would qualify for it. But also what was going on at the time was the comp plan was still struggling to be completed. There was political discussions which had not been settled on the office issues, and the office cap came out of that. There were retail preservation political issues, and there was other unsettlement at the time around just development in general. And the Sobratos felt very uncomfortable that if this went forward in that context, that would be the lightning rod to solve all of the political outstanding issues in the city. So we asked what the urgency was, and there wasn't necessarily a specific urgency other than the comp plan suggested it be planned, and the MTC VTA had money available in a grant. So what we offered to the city at that time was, if you defer and when the time is right, you come back to do this planning, and if the VTA and MTC did not have that grant money, we would match what those dollars were. And that's exactly what happened with our contribution of $250,000 towards this particular plan, was from a prior commitment that we made to allow for this process to happen. It wasn't born, and this is where some confusion might be in the room and by the community, is this process is not born by the fact that the Sobratos have an active application on file And curious that I've been here all this time and no one's asked if I had an application on file and what my desire was for the project. But being that the staff's report speaks to it, and then there was plenty of discussion in the newspaper that referenced the fact that we had no development, I don't want you to think that was a revelation and that's new. That has been our position for quite a while as far as redeveloping this site by removing it and building something different. So I wanted to make sure you appreciated those points. And also what was in some of the articles was that Fry's is vacating. Fry's, when we bought the property, had a lease in place and it had a 5-year option, which they exercised since we bought it, and the expiration of that option is in January of 2020. They have no further rights, but if you go through their space, I think you'll get a sense that it wasn't doing very well and that it was actually should be closing or changing the model for this space anyway. They're currently in approximately 85 to 87,000 square feet, and there's some confusion over what you're measuring in that space and what's anyway, but there's someone in there. And to answer partially your question, that interesting is that when the zoning was amended, the zoning specifically says that the maximum amount of retail in the building, in this 220 plus thousand square foot continuous building, that retail shall not exceed 60,000 square feet. However, it was in the record that the owner of the property at the time said, but there's 87 occupied by Fry's alone. So there's been some confusion over time, and John and I have had these conversations as the building comes vacant and gets re-tenanted, is what does all that really mean? And it's somewhat a little confusing, but somewhere between 60 and 87,000 square feet is how much retail should be in that building under the existing zoning. So our intent was to sit here, participate, listen to your values, and see what is it that we want to do with the property over time. I don't have something that in my back pocket. I'm waiting for this process to unfold. And then we have the historic information, which we're still digesting. Not sure exactly what that plays within it, but our current position today is not to tear the building down necessarily, but to repurpose it. I do want to say that we value the fact that the city has in their general plan and in their arena numbers 221 units allocated to this site for residential. We don't want to ignore that. We don't disregard it. We don't discount it. But it's hard to achieve that today, especially if we aren't going to redevelop the property. We do have some ideas of how we could get some, but I want to have that for another time. But I wanted to provide that information to you and wanted to allow you to poke and ask me any questions you might have. So thank you, Rachel, for giving me the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll just kind of go around and raise your hand. I'll just try to keep order, but we also want to make sure we can have a dialogue and Tim has a chance to respond to people's questions. So, go ahead, Angela?
So thank you very much for that clarification. And you said that the intent now is to repurpose the building when the time is right, correct?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. I thought that's what.
We don't have plans to remove it.
Okay.
Start with that. We have tenants that go throughout the building, including Fry's. They don't all go vacant at the same time.
Right.
They're paying market rate rents, and the building is economically viable the way it currently is. So unless there's something that suggests something different, we don't have a reason to change what is there today in general.
Right. Right. Okay. So could it hypothetically be possible that at some time in the future, Sobrados might be interested in putting housing inside some of these buildings? In other words, repurposing them for housing?
I would suggest that the economic conditions of the market where we are today would have to change substantially, because you wouldn't get very many units in it, and the rent would essentially go down for your expense to convert it to residential. So there isn't to convert the existing building that way.
It would be costly.
It would be extremely costly. Back to what I said with just the Playground Global, to structurally retrofit the building to support just commercial occupancy as an open office space is extremely expensive. To then put in all new mechanical, plumbing, drainage, fire sprinklers, and structural upgrades to the building and so forth to accommodate residential within that structure goes far beyond the economic viability that residential would support in that.
And if
Today.
if it were to be, if you were to use that retail space for retail again, would that also be costly to repurpose it for new retail, in other words?
Yes.
Okay.
I want to offer that there's two answers to that. The other half of it is that the fry space is about dead center in that building, with no street presence, no visibility, nothing. And someone that is even location dominant like Fry's couldn't make that location work for many reasons. I think those are similar reasons that other retailers would have a struggle with going into their vacant space.
Yeah. So it's almost like nothing should go there. Sorry.
I'm not prepared to say there's nothing, and I'm not prepared to say maybe there is a little bit of something that doesn't have to pay for itself. But in the larger picture, it's easier to not do anything at all and keep it vacant than trying to put something in there that won't pay for the improvements you need to put something in there. Sorry.
Kirsten?
Confusing.
I have a couple of questions. You are going to have some level of vacancy after Fry's moves out.
Yes.
Does the building still pencil out if that remains empty? Or would that have to be converted to office space?
Well, partially answer with Angela is that the space, Fry's has been in since the 80s, I believe. And there's been a lot of, a lot of code changes. The building is woefully understructured, and so just getting it in a structural position, getting it in a mechanical, electrical, all the various pieces, retail rents will not support what it takes to do that, and it would be far more economically smart to do zero than it would be to put money in that you can't get any money back for. If that makes sense. So retail won't pay the rent to go in there.
Okay, so then I have two follow-up questions. One, could you describe for us or help us understand the scenario under which market forces allow housing to be built? Because what I've heard a lot is that market forces are not allowing housing to be built except if it's full. The one segment of the housing plan that we're actually meeting, or within 14 units of meeting, something like that.
What are you referring to?
Full price, upper end housing. So that's number one question. I'll give you both of them, so just in case you want to combine your answers. Could you help us understand when market forces are favorable for housing, or what that might mean? And second, to take a step back and just as a sort of a developer who is a citizen of the Bay Area, I'm of course distressed, as are most people, that our kids can't live here, that the person who serves my Starbucks has to travel 2 or 3 hours to work at that menial job just to get an apartment they can afford. And I'm sure it's something that developers think a lot about. You know, I mean, you must have, everyone in your organization must think about that. How do you picture solutions coming? And this can be answered in a very general way, not specific to this site, but the question about what kind of market forces favor residential development is sort of, I'm directing that question more at that site.
Jeez. You should have asked Steve Levy while he was here.
Well, he tries to do this.
The Sobrato's primary business in the past has been single-tenant office buildings for large corporate. and they keep their properties in the family. And over time, they wanted to diversify their risk because single-tenant office buildings have high risk. They're either occupied or they're not. And when they're not, you get nothing. Whereas apartments, multifamily apartments, their general occupancy in the Bay Area, even though they have about a 50% turnover in a year, their general occupancy stays above 90%. So if you invest in it, right, you're going to get at least 90% of the projected income over an average year, which is much different risk factor than a single-tenant office building, and the two complement each other. But the two have much different returns because of that expectation. It's like if you put money in your savings account, you get 0.25%. That's reflecting the risk of putting your money in a savings account. If you put your money in a NASDAQ stock, you might not get any of it back. So, I mean, there's an extreme to what you're investing, but you might make a lot of money if it hits black or red on the roulette table. So the two are that way, but because they're that way, there's a very thin margin between what you get in rent and what it costs you to build it. There's very little. And we're at the very end of the very bottom of that, I'm trying to do economics 101, they're at the very bottom of the scale because the interest rates are so low. But there's no margin for error. So as we see costs go up, which they have for rental properties at a higher rate than rents have gone up to accommodate the return, the apartments are becoming almost infeasible across the whole Bay Area. And you're seeing it more and more as developers are pulling back. I have a 44-unit project approved in the city of Palo Alto, which you would think would be highly valuable in this market, and we can't figure out a way to make it economically viable as rental property. We historically have not ourselves built ownership housing, being the more successful today, but there's more of a margin because there's more of a risk for the developer to get his return before the market turns and so forth.
It's empty until it's sold.
Yes, and banks require you to sell X amount of units before they'll loan to those borrowers, and so it makes it even more complex the larger the project is. But historically also, ownership development for single-family homes is very litigious also. And we aren't really fans of going to court to defend ourselves, and so we've got other options to do things than put ourselves in a litigious environment. So when I look at this, we are only looking at it typically from our lens, which is a multifamily project. There is pressure, and there are developers who are willing to do ownership housing opportunities. And we could partner in some respect with someone in that direction at some point, which we're looking at on this other 44-unit project I mentioned. But it's not our business model, and it's something we don't typically pursue, and we feel uncomfortable pursuing it, and I'm not sure we're comfortable with pursuing it here today. I'm just saying, it's trying to answer your question.
Yes, good question. Thank you. The 44 unit, what is the use there? I missed that.
The 44 residential units we have approved in the city, we originally entitled with the intent of renting them. But in the period of time it took to get our entitlements, which not all on the city, there was some of us delaying our own decision-making, but costs went up more than rents went up, and costs across all levels, being the construction market, the fees and expectations of extractions from the city, utility companies wanting more than they normally would. All the various pieces that add up to a very thin margin made them economically infeasible to build as rental. And no fault to everybody's interest in moving it forward, is just the economy kind of didn't play well with us over that period of time.
And then, as far as...
You only get 3 questions.
That was only 2. As far as how, I mean, as a citizen, how does Sobrato think about how the solutions might come to the housing crisis?
I want to hear this.
Yes, you're kicking me too. I mean, this is not site-specific, okay? But
Yeah, not site-specific at all, yeah.
and John, this is not meant to lash out at you particularly, but there is...
I'm just enjoying that you're the one getting peppered with the questions.
I volunteered for this, I really did.
He's about to say it's all in the codes.
No, I felt you guys deserved to have a conversation, so. That's true. There's so many things that are wrong with the system of getting a home built in California. We talked a lot about it at the beginning, about trying to figure out what CEQA means. And CEQA had a very good intent when it came forward in California, but it's extremely misused by NIMBYs of any sort, and not necessarily a neighbor that lives next door, but by unions that want to stall your project to get you to give them something at the table. Somebody that doesn't want a business in the city and they get a drive-through restaurant approved, they challenge the CEQA as a way of delaying it to the point they don't build it and go to another city. The cities have no real recipe for how many dollars of fees and extractions a project can handle. And there's some, it's political. If you bring forward a park fee, and all you're talking about in that meeting is park fee, it's easy to justify park fees are the most important thing. And you give it all the numbers that the staff brings forward. But when you add the park fee to all the other fees, then, which is how you should be looking at all your fees, is what is the total burden of all the things you control on a project? Across the state, I'm not picking on Palo Alto specifically, but across the state, that's a burden. The cost of living, the cost of labor, all goes into the cost of building the product. The time to get through the entitlements, all these things really put a very big impact on something like rental property that has a very, very thin margin. And we're in an extremely low interest rate environment. So when that interest rate goes up 2 points, you're going to see a lot of sins get uncovered. And there's an old saying my grandfather used is rising tides, right? Lower tide's going to expose everything underneath that we've been hiding.
Dirty garbage.
There's no one thing, it's a lot. There's a lot of things there. Does that mean we turn our head? No, I think the foundation, the philanthropic side of the Sobrado organization, which is the right vehicle, has put an inordinate amount of money into different nonprofit housing funds where they have the best vision of how to leverage. There's a lot to say for how a nonprofit gets money to build apartments, and they have to call together many different sources, but one of the most important ones is tax credits. And when you put affordable housing as a condition on a market rate, it makes it almost impossible to get and compete for those tax credits. So you're putting a further burden on the market rate units that you're building with the burden of providing for those affordable units within the project. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong, it just means it cripples the ability and all the options available to work in a very thin market. So I could talk a long time on this topic, obviously.
I find it fascinating, thank you.
So I just want to note that we kind of tied this moment to our discussion of the building and the historic, and I don't want us to go too far to the bounds of what was noticed, kind of how this plays into our development of our alternatives, which is also the agenda. So if these are really good questions, I don't want us to have a conversation, but I want to make sure that we're kind of thinking in that frame of thinking about the building's historic purpose and also kind of its role in our three alternatives, which is what we're trying to tee up next. But with that little note, are there any other questions that folks have for Tim or comments on the building, the 340 Portage building, or its historic, significance, or questions you want, us to take down that we want to, answer next time?
Gail, if you can just make sure you're using your mic. Thank you.
I should know this, right? The seismic safety standards, the structural requirements in this building, how would you characterize that at this moment?
The bottom part, as I indicated earlier, they spent an inordinate amount of money bringing it up to seismic. the space that Fry's has been in. They've been in since the 80s, and the 89 building code, or the 89 earthquake created quite a bit of upgrades, I think in 3 different seismic structural additions to the building code. So just when that goes vacant, we're just scared to death to break it down and figure out all the seismic issues there, just to retrofit for occupancy.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Mhm.
I know you said that retail wasn't going to be a good idea. I was just wondering if you have looked into alternative retail options, like something like stalls, like the Ferry Building or anything like that, if that would be any more doable, if that was considered at all.
It's a very big space in the middle of that building. It's very deep. And no, we're not a retail specialist, and it's not something we do. We don't have a lot of retail. We have a couple neighborhood shopping centers, but that is a very special kind of way of doing retail, and there's not very many people that have been able to do it successfully and survive, and no, we haven't gone that far down that road.
Great. Thanks for your question. Anything else?
So again, how are we going to go about evaluating the financial feasibility of our schemes? Because, like to make them real, right? How, if we wait to the end, then that will be kind of too late, right? Is there a process that we're going to do it when we're still in the process of making some decisions?
Yes, so one of the things that we added, or I would say modified about our contract with Perkins Will is ensuring that we would have some financial analysis of each of the 3 alternatives. There'll be an even deeper level of the preferred alternative when we get there, but we will make sure that we look at each of the 3 alternatives and understand their financial feasibility. So what that does mean is that as we develop the alternatives, they need to have a little bit more detail than we might have envisioned when we first began this project, because they'll have to know enough about, like, for example, how many units might be on a parcel and, what's the bedroom mix, so that they could know what would the rent be, projected to be on that unit. So it's a little more detailed than just saying, oh, this is housing, this is retail, this is office, this is how high it is. So we'll get some of that feedback, which will help us to evaluate the alternatives against each other and understand the trade-offs between, well, this might be someone's, have some of the great things that they want, but it shows that it might not ever come to pass. Well, would that be something we would want to pursue? And also kind of what we can, learn from each alternative in order to incorporate it into the final preferred alternative. So with that, maybe what I'll do is talk a little bit about where we go from here. And Angela, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, sort of along those lines, I was wondering if the city could provide us with a variety of different creative sources of funding for things like affordable housing, support of retail, which is so difficult to keep going in this area, and like services like the Mayfield Clinic has been brought up several times, and then the creek restoration. I don't know, there must be creative ways of funding those things, and I'm wondering if the city could help us understand those.
We certainly can. I think one of the things that is also part of the analysis is understanding, if there are changes in the land use or what's permissible on different parts of the entire site, so not just 340 Portage, but the entire project area, what would be the projected economic value of that, and how would we want to either capture or direct that value? So, for example, some might say if you require, affordable housing in a market rate development, that's saying, hey, you're going to get this much value from having housing here, and we want you to use some of that value to give back to those who can't afford market rate housing. Or you might say, oh, you know what? We want to use some of that value to restore the creek, and so maybe there's less affordable housing, but there's creek restoration. Or we might say, oh, well, this office pays this much, or R&D or whatnot, and then if we can capture some of that value, we can direct it to these things. But there are all these trade-offs, and it's also math that, as Tim is experiencing with Mike's Bikes, can change pretty quickly, right? So some of it still, as the market goes up and down in the future, we still have to kind of use our best estimates and guesses at how we can actually have these things come to fruition. So that's, I asked your question to try to figure out, what can we expect in amenities or public kind of goods from these development and make sure we can have some diverse things that exist in the site.
There might also be like grants and things like that. I'm not sure really how it works, but there might be different programs that provide funding, and I don't know. Yeah, we don't know about those, so you guys do.
Yeah,
Yeah, so just to add on to that, I mean, I think we're hearing and there's only so much that we're going to be able to recapture from redevelopment. And so it is a big issue, obviously, of how do we fund all these interests that we have, whether it's open space, the Matadero Creek, community centers, clinics, that might need nonprofit funding support. So, and we'll certainly do our best to flag and identify those sort of deficiencies and some options for how that might be captured. But in the end, it's, while grant money is great, it sometimes it comes with strings attached. And ultimately, the council will need to contemplate as it does its long-range forecasting of where does it want to spend its money on capital improvements, what areas get redeveloped. And again, as we think about this site, we do need to take the long view and just continue to remind ourselves that this is a 15, 20-year plan, and we may come up with this wonderful document, but we need to realize that there's going to be time that, it's going to take time to realize that vision.
As you were talking, I remembered that there is this grant from the Santa Clara County Water District about habitat restoration.
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of those that are around. And,
So
and
great.
it'll get us so far, and then there's the delta that we need to figure out.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about just what's coming up, and we'll recap our talk about our future meetings at the end as well to remember our upcoming schedule. But just to talk about what's next is really working to come up with what those three alternatives are. So that'll be the main topic of our next meeting. We also will have in the near future a report back from WRA, which is our consultant, to look at the creek restoration. So that should be this fall heading into winter time. We'll work on having them come to one of our future meetings, not the next meeting, but one shortly thereafter. And in terms of the three alternatives, one of the things we've been doing, we heard last time, was making sure that you guys have a chance to, as the working group, have input into what those three different alternatives are. So I'm going back and combing through the meeting notes and the meeting minutes from the previous meetings that you've had, which were very rich, lots of good exercises, learning lots about you guys and your work. And so trying to use that information to help bring potentially some ideas of what those alternatives could look like and get your feedback. So for example, as Jonathan had mentioned earlier this evening, thinking about is there an example of here's a alternative that retains 340 portage and somehow throughout the rest of the site still realizes the goals of housing and grid reconnection to this extent feasible. Is there an option that looks at maybe part of 340 and all these things? And Sobrato organization's kind of vision notwithstanding, we can at least evaluate those and understand those and, begin working towards understanding the trade-offs between all of those. And then once we have those kind of tent poles of what those three alternatives looks like, that's where we'll be able to get to some of that further development and analysis and come back to the working group with, okay, here's what they look like, here's some of the trade-offs, and we can have that discussion about, what are we learning from them.
A quick comment. I think it's really, really important that we get information, our informational packets, as soon as possible before the next meetings. I can't stress that enough, because when you get information the night before a meeting, you're not very prepared for that meeting. So again, that's critically important to all of us, I believe, to make sure we have enough preparation so that when we come to these meetings, we can make good decisions and good discussions too.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. We will definitely work on that and make sure that we do that in the future.
On the WRA, I don't know that we'll have a report. Are they going to come and more, I thought they were going to just sort of present their initial findings, but maybe you have more on that.
They will come in, they'll have some output that will be incorporated into what Perkinson Will does, and then there's kind of, I would have to look back at the scope, but there's kind of a preliminary report to what goes into the alternatives.
And is it your thought that we'll have that to share with the working group at the meeting, or?
Not next meeting, but at a future meeting this fall, kind of winter time, so, yeah. Okay, so with that, we'll go to oral communications. Oh, sorry.
So will those alternatives come with economic analyses?
So.
Because I think that we're
So,
really.
No, not next week, no. Not
Not
the
next week,
Yeah, not
no.
the next meeting. So this is really, and we'll work with our co-chairs on this very topic, because you understand sort of the basic, we've painted the sort of menu of options, I guess. That's a total mixed metaphor there, too. I'm not even sure where I was going with that. But the point is, there's 3 options that we're looking for that we think capture the interests that we've had. We are mindful of the housing element and the number of units that are anticipated to be produced on this site. We heard from Steve Levy earlier, and it's come up a couple times in the working group discussion. So when I think about the plan area, sort of the base midline sort of scenario, and with this, I say this understanding that this could be moderated in some way, but as I approach this challenge, as we look at the project boundary, we have a certain number of housing units that our housing element is anticipating being produced within this project boundary. So a baseline scenario, to me, at least at this point, is a plan that meets that number, that at least meets that number. And then I would think that there'd be another scenario that goes above that number for those who have expressed an interest to go big on housing. Okay, so if we went more, what would that look like? And then there's another perspective of, well, what if we did scale that back and did less? Maybe because we want to preserve the building in some way. And so that would be a third scenario. And so working with the co-chairs, we're going to want to understand how we can begin to have some of these preliminary conversations so that we can have a more fruitful conversation with our consultant, so that when we do have that presentation with this group about the alternatives, it is moving us in the direction of getting these plans developed so that we can present it to the public. And as we develop those plans, embedded in that process will be this historic analysis, because what we don't want to do is present a scenario to you and to the public that's not feasible, that's not going to get built. Now, it may not get built in today's economic condition, which may be at the sort of high end of where we are, but maybe as it trails back a little bit, maybe it is feasible. I mean, we don't have the crystal ball, we don't know, and so we need to think about that. And so I think the intent of the next meeting is to begin to get the working group members to be thinking about, okay, if there are these 3 different alternatives, you may identify with one of them, and specifically, like, oh, I like this plan here, and that's great. You'll have some good input to be able to offer to that. I'm sorry, I'm looking this way and I'm not engaging you guys. What we would also ask is 2 things. One is, remember, it's a long-range plan. We may not have the benefit of this plan so much as, the next generation of folks that might be living here, so we should be thinking about them. And 2, we would encourage you to sort of step out of your preferred scenario and think about it from, okay, these other 2 scenarios maybe aren't quite aligned with my interests, but let me see how I can evolve them in a way that captures the things that I'm interested in, even though I don't really support the ultimate sort of conclusion, right? Does that make sense? Step out of your sort of interest and then see how we can advance these other ones. So I think part of the conversation at the next meeting is to begin to develop that. And again, we welcome the opportunity to work with the co-chairs to develop that thought. Doria.
Yeah, and one of my concerns is that we need to remember the rest of the area. It's not
That's
just
right.
about the Fry's site. And with regards to any housing increase in the area, we're going to have to think about our needs to increase parks and walkable and bikeable areas, and what to do about Park Avenue, because it's a very important bike route and it's not a very safe one, actually. it's one that presents a lot of problems. So, I mean, I think we have a lot of other things to think about, including, I think most importantly, the little R1 neighborhood, you know, 2.5 blocks or whatever. So I don't want to just, I don't want to lose sight of the overall plan because we're over-focused on Fry's, and I think that sort of happens.
I feel, yeah, I absolutely agree. And what I had said before was not just a Fry's discussion. It was the project boundaries. It's the totality. I'm not just looking at the 221 realistic units that we can anticipate on the Fry's site. I'm looking at all of the units within the project boundary that we have. What could be anticipated, and at the end of the day, if we have a number that's less than that, then we need to concurrently also find some other properties where we're going to get some more housing units so that we don't have the problem with HCD saying, hey, you're not consistent now. You've just adopted something that's inconsistent with your general plan, and we'll get a letter like Cupertino did with the whole Valco mall scenario.
Right, but there's also the reality that we're dealing with, as Tim Steele told us, that, you know, they came and asked for the Mike's Bikes project, which was all retail and a lot of residential, I forget, 50-some units. And now, very shortly after it was approved, it's no longer, you know, feasible for them. So I think we really have to take that in consideration as well when we're thinking about this. I mean, the zoning can still be there, but what's going to happen? They're not going to...
Yeah, well, I think that cuts multiple
site.
ways.
Yeah.
Again, the more we ask of a developer, the less we're going to get in some other areas. So it's a complex conversation with a lot of moving parts. And I want to just, I mentioned this to Tim in our conversations, but I also want to acknowledge it. We did recently adopt the Housing Incentive Program, and I would strongly encourage the Serato organization to come in and have a conversation with us to see how we can help support your bottom line on that development project.
Waldeck and then Kirsten.
Is there a minimum size of those units that we are trying to provide?
A minimum area?
No,
The unit area?
Yes, unit area.
No, I think that, you know, we're anticipating that there's a mix of housing units. I mean, we don't want to just put all of our interest in one, you know, studio apartments or large, you know, family units. I think that's the blend of units that we're interested in. We don't have a prescribed area.
But there is no, like, standard that is required.
The building code, I think, has a requirement of, I don't know, 200 and some odd square feet or something like that. So whatever the,
220 or something.
you know, that's the only limitation that we have is what's defined as a habitable space under the building code.
Kirsten?
It might be here in front of me in this Perkins and Wells report. I'm on the right page, but I'm not skimming fast enough. Of the 220 units in the housing plan, are those all on a particular site, or is that for Ventura, the NV cap outline as a whole?
So that's the 340 Portage site.
So can we get information on what it is that is in the housing plan
Yes.
for the whole site?
We can. I don't have that number, but yes, that's the
Okay,
the
and
number that we need
then,
to get.
and also, how many of those, I'm sure council has a preference of how many of those are in these different categories, because
income
we're
categories.
closer to meeting certain categories rather than other categories.
Right, and so this, I mean, this is an area where, I mean, yeah, we're I would say, just on target with our market rate housing.
Above moderate,
Yeah, it's an 8-year housing cycle, and from year to year, you know, I think we're just skimming above the line for market. We're clearly not meeting the other income levels, but nobody is, and not that that's an excuse. That I think reflects the economics that we heard from Tim a moment ago about how these things pencil out. You don't have private developers building low-income housing. That is sort of a niche market.
Well, you make up the money somehow, either with subsidies or with.
Even if you look at the affordable housing,
You have to get.
in lieu fees will, you know, takes time to build up those resources. It's a competitive process. The tax credits that they need to secure to help make it pencil. We've heard estimates that the Wilton Court project, the one, the 800,000 per unit. That's not inexpensive to build an affordable housing unit. And so, I mean, the numbers are extraordinary. Anyways, I'm getting off.
It's okay. Getting off
Rachel's
agenda.
cutting me off.
Okay, Lund has a question, and then I hear, Gail, and we'll go to Angela.
Yeah, so I think Tim mentioned, we said 60 to 87,000 square feet of retail and 220,000 square feet total in the 340. So I think it's also something important to think about in doing this analysis. So if this property were just a blank slate and it was an empty piece of land, that's a very different economic analysis than saying you have 220,000 square feet, 100 and whatever, which is office. If that's currently generating income, then that's, to your point, that's creating a benefit that could potentially help build housing. So it seems like if we're going to look at this even as a blank slate, we got to say, okay, there's close to 200,000 square feet of office. Maybe we need more office than that to incentivize to get the 220 units. So there's kind of this trade-off in the economic analysis because you're not dealing with a blank slate. And I understand maybe over time this building runs down, you have to develop it, but it seems like realistically if we want anything to happen on the aggregate site anytime in the near term, you got to factor if there's an office there, you're probably going to have to keep the office or add to it in order to get housing, because that's the economic trade-off that a developer looks at. Because if it's just, I'm going to tear this down and build housing, it doesn't make sense.
But these economic forces are exactly why we're in a housing crisis. I mean, is there any hope for California? I mean,
Gotta have some hope. It's definitely a challenge, a big challenge, though, for sure.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm not trying to overplay the issue, but I do think just being real in terms of the analysis, we have to look at what's there, because it's not just an empty piece of land.
totally get it, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just, you'll get the hook whenever you need to do that. But I'll just say that reflects conversations that I've had with folks too. I mean, the baseline of redeveloping a property depends on what is there. And we heard earlier when we were meeting that, Sobrato organization is turning somewhere around $8 a square foot for, some of the tenants that are in that building. That's an extraordinarily high barrier to replace that income stream. And so, and to Lund's comment a moment ago, I've spoken with other developers where housing, today housing is funded by office development. And we don't necessarily want to hear that, but that's the message that we're getting. And so
It just seems like that just makes us more broken.
Well, but here's I think, one area that I think Rachel was alluding to is we have very strong policies in Palo Alto about housing and about office development and where that gets built. And part of that is because of our housing imbalance, which we know is quite high. And so I guess one question that we'll want to contemplate as we think about these different scenarios is we don't want to make that imbalance worse, but can we keep it, are there ways that we can incrementally improve it? And if we know that office development is necessary to provide housing, how do we ensure that we're getting at least the right number of housing units to offset the increase in worker needs, worker housing that is required to support that office development? And that's not just the workers that are going to be in the building, but those that would support those workers through services. And there's some number, and I don't have the number off the top of my head, but there's some number of units per 1,000 square feet of office, that might be doable. And so if we can get to a place where we're not making the jobs to housing balance worse and in fact improving it, might there be an appetite in Palo Alto for more office development? I mean, that's a question that I think I'd like to pose at some point.
Gail had a hand?
Yes, a couple comments. I think what is, at least in my mind, what keeps happening is okay, we want to have sufficient background and economic understanding to begin working on alternative scenarios. But there's a danger of the dream team happening without a foundation in economics. So I guess the question is, taking all the information and all the input we've provided so far, in working with the consultants, you're suggesting, and this makes sense, that you're trying to pull together all the different visioning, scenarios, and ideas we've had that will inform the consultants and the staff and us regarding alternative scenarios. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. But I guess my concern is, I won't go on and on about this, is what is that balance between sufficient economic understanding to have viable scenarios that make sense and are worth additional analysis. So that's where we keep getting tripped up, right? Because if we're envisioning without an understanding of the trade-offs, it's not as useful of an exercise. So the question then is, how do you roll it out? And if I had an answer, that'd be great. I don't, and I think it's complex. I don't think any of us do. But that is concerning, right? Because you want to have the input meaningful and informed to a level where we're spending time on scenarios that make sense, that are feasible, right? And many people have said this, but I'm just, thinking out loud. But I think there's a kind of a balance and a trade-off here so that we feel we're making progress, but we're not engaging in dream team activities.
I think there is a balance. I think it is, though, a process where you go forward and then you go back and you revisit, right? So there's a bit of process where we don't have to have every step be perfect. And so what I envision would happen is we'll have these three scenarios. There's some, insight that we have from our consultant team, from our professional experience that we can bring to bear to say, this, might be more of like a pie in the sky dream and might not really be feasible based on, what we know about other things and using our just experience to inform that. At the same time, when we come with these three scenarios, they'll be hopefully very distinct and have some differences. And then we're probably not going to just choose one of them. One of them is probably not going to be, oh man, this is so perfect, everyone loves it, and it's feasible, and it's great, and let's do it. We're probably going to learn from each of them through the analysis that happened and find out, man, we really wanted that thing, but it doesn't work, so we're going to have to tweak it like this way, and then it comes with this other one, and we kind of bring them back together. So I think there is a bit of iteration. I don't want us to stop going forward for fear of not having information. We almost have to go forward in order to get more information and then kind of come back and revisit things.
Right. I see hybrids. I see a whole bunch of things. The other thing is, which has been alluded to, is if this plan is a 5, 10, 20-year plan, of course, we're not prophetic. We don't know what the state legislation will require of cities. So we can do something that's quite good that may be partially not so relevant in 10 years because the whole political climate and other issues have changed. But we can't solve every problem with this plan, but that's kind of one of the other moving targets, which does impact the pace at which things happen. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's enough.
That's another assignment for the co-chairs.
Okay. Okay. I don't know if I saw someone. Angela, did you have a hand? I can't. Yeah.
So, I've spent some time thinking of all the different ways the city can help us. Sorry, I don't want to add too much to your list of things to do. But I loved having the information about the history, and I'm looking forward to the creek information. I'm also interested in getting some information about the toxic plume, which I know is in that whole area. And so if we could get some kind of technical information about that, it would be great. And also, I'd love to hear, Karen mentioned one day about that there are people in the city who could give us ideas on incorporating arts and culture into whatever development. So I'd love to hear ideas from the people. I guess there's an art department or something in the city. Arts Commission, and they might be able to give us some great information and ideas too. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So we're going to go to public comment now. Robin, do we have speaker cards for public comment?
Okay, go ahead, Cedric.
Great, thank you. Thanks, good discussion today. A couple things. One, I was really dismayed by the council meeting. They came so close to just putting the kibosh on this whole thing when it came out that the owner was thinking, oh, we don't want to develop, which is understandable. But really, as people were saying, this is a long-term vision, so it doesn't really matter what the owner the various properties want to do in the next 5 or 10 years, 20 years, what does the community want to see happen? So I was really disappointed that the council came that close to canceling it, and I think that would have sent a really bad message to the community, so I'm glad they didn't. On the question of the discussion with the property owner, I think it's interesting to think about how much funding would be needed from the city. Maybe the city says housing is a valuable thing, and the city will put forward money of its own through some source, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be grants. So for the city to think about how much money could we put forward, and for the owners to think about how much money would be needed as a subsidy to enable the affordability of creating housing, particularly lower market rate housing. I had a general question about, are all housing units considered equal regarding housing allocations? Is a 1-bedroom the same as a 4-bedroom? Let's see, on the creek, that's coming up, but I would ask that we look at what is the highest ecological benefit that we can derive for the creek, what is the highest ecological good that we can do. We've significantly degraded the quality of our environment. Birds are on decline, everything's on decline. We're kind of, we've broken everything, we need to fix it. So we need to really invest in what is the best ecological value for the creek. And then finally, recently we lost another bakery. We lost Palo Alto Bakery on California. We lost a Prolific Oven downtown. We lost Prolific Oven because they couldn't hire bakers because of the cost of living. So I would love the committee, the community, the city to consider ways that we could support our local businesses. And I would suggest that one model would be an income on high income tax earners. A tax on high income earners, such as myself. I would be happy to pay more taxes if I knew that it was going to go towards supporting the wages of people employed by locally owned businesses, services, and retail. I think it's very important to have a local baker that I can get a good, tasty cake for my birthday and not some icky Safeway cake, So, services like a bakery are really important to the community. That's important to everybody, high or low income. And the reason we can't have a bakery is because of these housing pressures from high income earners. So we need a way to equalize that. Thank you.
Karen?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I really appreciate, Tim, your coming forward with comments and explanations on several things. I think it was certainly helpful for me, and I think it's probably helpful for most of the working group members too, and I don't want to speak for them. But so I'm going to suggest that not everybody is at the table that needs to be at the table. And by that, I mean I have limited experience with Sobrato, but the experiences I do have lead me to think that you're open-minded about how to approach things. I've heard many comments from members of the working group. I think they're open-minded about, it seems that they're open-minded about how to approach different things. So what I'm suggesting is that in developing scenarios and options and alternatives, that there look to be partnerships with other entities in the community, or even develop other entities in the community, who might be willing to come forward and partner with some property owner, maybe Sobrato, maybe some other partners, some other property owner in the community, to create a community good, a community benefit that hasn't been fleshed out. But if we just talk about, using planning tools for what we can do here and what we can do there and how many housing units we can get and how much retail we can get, we're really limiting the dialogue. And Jonathan, you said at the last meeting, I think it was, like, let's suspend thoughts of zoning. And while I think we can't totally suspend thoughts of zoning because there are some planning basics that have to be held in place, but I think there does need to be a lid removed on how creative we can be in this really wonderful opportunity that exists, a really, truly wonderful opportunity that exists. And I just want to appreciate Cedric's comments too. Thanks.
That's it.
Okay, so if you, on the back of the first page of the agenda, our next meeting is October 29th. We'll be back in City Hall. A few days before Halloween, we'll have, I was going to say, you can wear your costume if you dare. And we'll try to have some candy along with our dinner. And if there's no further comments or questions, I believe that the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, and there's an 8:17 train. Well, I could dash, but then who's cleaning up? Wow, Rebecca's still here.
He's got 2 kids, right? Yeah. That's why I think maybe in some ways it's actually, because if you can keep that as office, just throwing it out there. If you were to keep the basic 340, the whole thing, add 60,000 feet of retail even, convert it to office, you can build 200 units or something.